The sun had barely begun its descent, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban neighborhood. It was a peaceful evening, at least. It should have been. Harold Evans, a 72-year-old retired schoolteacher, walked down the sidewalk at his usual leisurely pace, his cane tapping against the pavement with every step. Dressed in a neatly pressed button-up shirt and slacks, he carried a small paper bag containing a few groceries he had picked up from the store 2 blocks away. Despite his age, Harold had always been an independent man. He preferred walking over taking the bus, even if it took him a little longer. He enjoyed the rhythm of his own steps, the soft breeze brushing against his face, the familiar sight of the homes he had known for years. But tonight, something felt off. A police cruiser slowed as it approached the intersection. Harold barely paid it any mind at first. This was a quiet area, and police officers often patrolled in the evenings. But as he reached the street corner, he noticed the car had come to a stop just a few feet from him. The driver's side window rolled down, and a sharp voice cut through the stillness of the evening. "Hey, you, stop right there." Harold turned, frowning slightly. The officer behind the wheel was a young man, no older than his own grandson. His uniform was crisp, his short blonde hair neatly combed. His badge reflected the dimming sunlight. Harold recognized the look in the officer's eyes, a mix of suspicion and condescension. "I'm sorry?" Harold asked, adjusting his grip on his cane. The officer, whose name tag read D. Carter, stepped out of the vehicle, one hand resting on his holstered firearm. "What are you doing out here?" Harold's frown deepened. "I live around the corner. I was just getting some groceries." He lifted the bag slightly, as if that would explain everything. Carter's eyes darted to the bag but quickly returned to Harold's face. "We had reports of a suspicious individual in the area," he said, stepping closer. "Matches your description." Harold's heart sank. He knew what was happening. He had seen it too many times before. It didn't matter that he had lived in this neighborhood for decades. It didn't matter that he had dedicated his life to teaching generations of children, some of whom had likely grown up to be police officers themselves. All that mattered was the color of his skin. "I think you must be mistaken, officer," Harold said, his voice calm but firm. "I've done nothing wrong." Carter let out a short, humorless laugh. "Yeah? Let me be the judge of that. Turn around. Hands where I can see them." Harold's fingers tightened around his cane. "Now, hold on a minute," he said. "I don't see why this is necessary." Carter's expression darkened. "Are you resisting, old man?" Harold's pulse quickened. He knew better than to argue. The stories were always the same: an innocent black man stopped by police, a misunderstanding that turned violent. "I'm not resisting," Harold said, raising his free hand, "but I'd like to know why you're treating me like a criminal." Carter sneered. "Maybe because people like you are always up to something." Before Harold could respond, Carter grabbed his arm and yanked it behind his back. Pain shot through his shoulder as he stumbled forward, barely managing to keep his balance. The grocery bag fell to the ground, its contents spilling onto the pavement. "Please," Harold started, but Carter shoved him against the police car, his face pressing against the cold metal. "Shut up," Carter snapped. "You people are always playing the victim." A few passers-by had stopped, watching the scene unfold. Some looked horrified. One person raised their phone, recording, but no one intervened. Harold clenched his jaw, swallowing the humiliation rising in his throat. His body ached from the force of Carter's grip. He wanted to fight back, to demand respect, but he knew that would only make things worse. Carter patted him down roughly, muttering under his breath, "Yeah, nothing on you now, but I bet if I dig deep enough, I'll find something." Harold didn't reply. He had no words left. Harold sat stiffly in the back of the police car, his wrists aching from the too tight handcuffs. The ride to the precinct was silent, except for the occasional muttered curse from Carter, who seemed irritated that his suspect had turned out to be nothing more than an old man with a grocery bag. They arrived at the station, where Carter dragged Harold out of the car and marched him inside. The desk sergeant barely glanced up. This was routine, just another black man brought in for no reason other than a cop's whim. Carter shoved Harold into a chair and leaned down, his voice a low growl. "You think you're some kind of victim? Maybe if you people didn't act suspicious all the time, we wouldn't have to do this." Harold met his gaze, his voice steady. "I did nothing wrong." Carter laughed. "Yeah? Well, you're here now. Aren't you? Hours passed. No lawyer was called. No charges were filed. Harold sat in that cold, fluorescent-lit room, staring at the cracks in the wall, wondering if he would ever get to go home. When they finally let him go, it was well past midnight. No apology, no explanation, just a bruised wrist and a heart heavy with the weight of decades of injustice. As he stepped outside into the cold night air, Harold's chest ached, not from the beating, but from the knowledge that, even after all these years, nothing had really changed. Harold barely made it home before the pain became unbearable. His chest tightened. His breathing grew shallow. He reached for the phone, dialing the only number he knew by heart. James? His voice was weak, trembling. Son, I need you. The last thing Harold heard before the world faded to black was the sound of his son's voice. Filled with alarm, by the time James Evans arrived, his father was gone. James Evans was not a man who often lost control. He had built his career on composure, on logic, on the art of persuasion. But as he stood in the doorway of his father's home, looking down at the body of the man who had raised him, something inside him cracked. His father had survived segregation, had fought for education, had raised a son who had become one of the most powerful attorneys in the country. And yet, in the end, all it had taken was one racist cop to destroy him. James clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. This wasn't going to be another case of injustice swept under the rug. He was going to make them pay. He wasn't just a grieving son. He was a lawyer, and he knew exactly how to bring them down. James Evans had spent his life fighting for justice. As one of the most respected civil rights attorneys in the country, he had built his reputation on cases that exposed systemic racism and police brutality. He had seen countless families devastated by the same injustice his father had just suffered. He had comforted grieving mothers, fought in courtrooms where judges looked at him with veiled contempt, and dismantled police testimonies riddled with lies. But this time, it was personal. Standing in his father's modest living room, James felt a rage unlike anything he had ever known. His father, a man who had spent his entire life giving to his community, a man who had taught young children to read, who had worked tirelessly to give his son the education and opportunities he never had died humiliated and broken, beaten and discarded like a criminal by a racist cop who would likely get away with it. His mind raced. He had to move quickly. He had to make sure this wasn't swept under the rug like so many cases before. He had to ensure Daniel Carter paid for what he had done. James pulled out his phone and dialed a number. Marcus, he said, his voice sharp, controlled. On the other end, Marcus Hayes, a seasoned private investigator and James's closest ally in the legal world, picked up on the first ring. I saw the video. Man, Marcus said, his voice heavy. I knew your dad lived in that area. When I saw the name, James cut him off. I need everything on that cop. Marcus, I want his records, complaints, past cases, anything I can use. There was a beat of silence. Then, Marcus said, I'm on it. James ended the call and exhaled slowly, forcing himself to think rationally. He turned to his father's body, still on the floor where the paramedics had left him, his hands clenched into fists. There would be time for grief later. Right now, there was work to do. He was going to make them pay. Marcus worked fast. Within hours, he had compiled a file on Officer Daniel Carter that was damning. James sat at his desk, scrolling through the pages of information. Carter had a history of excessive force complaints, none of which had resulted in disciplinary action. He had been accused of using racial slurs during arrests, of fabricating charges, of brutalizing young black men under the pretense of keeping the streets safe. And yet, he had never been held accountable. James's jaw tightened. This was exactly what he had expected. Police departments across the country were experts at protecting their own. Carter's record was filled with red flags. But the system had always given him a free pass. Not this time. James leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. He had two battles ahead of him, the legal battle and the battle of public perception. He needed to control the narrative before the police department spun their own version of events, before they painted his father as some kind of threat to justify what had happened. He picked up his phone again, this time dialing a different number. Natalie, he said when she answered. Natalie Brooks was a top journalist for one of the nation's leading investigative news outlets. She had covered dozens of cases of police misconduct, exposing corruption at the highest levels. If there was anyone who could make sure this story reached the public, it was her. "James," she said, her voice cautious, "I heard about your father. I'm so sorry." James swallowed hard. "I need you to help me take this bastard down." Natalie hesitated for only a moment. Then, she said, "Tell me everything." The story broke the next morning. The video of Harold Evans being assaulted by Daniel Carter spread like wildfire. News outlets picked it up. Social media exploded with outrage. And within hours, there were calls for Carter's immediate suspension. Protesters gathered outside the police department, demanding justice. James watched the news coverage with a grim sense of satisfaction. This was only the beginning. He wasn't just going to get Carter fired, he was going to make sure he never wore a badge again. His phone rang. It was Marcus. "James," Marcus said, his voice urgent. I dug deeper. Carter isn't just another racist cop. He's connected. James frowned. Connected to what? To higher-ups. He's got protection from the top. James's grip on the phone tightened. How high up are we talking? Chief Richard Morris, Marcus said. He's been covering for Carter for years. Anytime Carter got into trouble, Morris made sure the complaints disappeared. James closed his eyes, his anger simmering. This was bigger than just one cop. It was a system built to protect men like Carter. So if I take down Carter, James began, you take down Morris, too. Marcus finished. James smiled coldly. Good. The police department wasted no time going on the defensive. Hours after the protests began, Chief Richard Morris held a press conference. We are conducting a full investigation into the matter, he said, standing at a podium with the city's mayor beside him. Officer Carter has been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. However, I urge the public to remain patient. We do not convict our officers based on social media outrage. James scoffed as he watched from his office. This was standard protocol. They would stall, make empty promises, wait for public attention to die down, and then quietly reinstate Carter once the dust settled. Not this time. He turned to Natalie, who was sitting across from him. They're going to try to bury this. She nodded. I figured as much. But we have an advantage, they don't know what we have. James leaned forward. I want to force their hand. I want Carter arrested. And I want Morris exposed. Natalie's eyes gleamed. Then let's give them no choice. That evening, Natalie's outlet released an exclusive exposé on Daniel Carter's history of violence. They published every complaint, every incident of excessive force that had been covered up. They named names, including Chief Morris, who had personally intervened to protect Carter multiple times. The effect was immediate. By the next morning, the city was in turmoil. More protests erupted, louder and more organized. The mayor, facing mounting pressure, announced that an independent investigation would be launched. And then came the breaking point. A second video surfaced. This one, captured by a different bystander, showed Carter assaulting another black man just months earlier, an incident that had been swept under the rug. The public outcry reached a fever pitch. By nightfall, Daniel Carter was officially charged with assault and misconduct. James allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. This was just the beginning. The real battle was about to start. James Evans had always known that justice was never truly won in a single battle. It was a war, a long, grueling war fought in courtrooms, in the media, and in the minds of the public. The arrest of Daniel Carter was a victory. But James wasn't naive enough to believe that it was the end. It was just the beginning. The police union had already mobilized its resources. Within hours of Carter's arrest, they issued a statement condemning the rush to judgment against one of their own, calling it a politically motivated witch hunt. Conservative news outlets picked up the story, painting Carter as a victim of cancel culture, a good officer who was simply doing his job. James knew what was coming next. The police department would attempt to quietly reinstate Carter. They would delay the trial, stall the investigation, let the outrage fade until people forgot. And if James let them, Carter would walk free. He wasn't going to let that happen. Sitting in his law office, James leaned forward, his hands clasped together as he studied the strategy map pinned to the wall in front of him. Every case was a battle, and every battle required a plan. He had Carter in check, but now he needed to go after the king, Chief Richard Morris. Marcus had uncovered enough dirt to prove that Morris had not only protected Carter but had actively covered up multiple cases of police brutality over the years. There was a trail of buried complaints, falsified reports, and even allegations of witness intimidation. James picked up his phone and dialed Marcus. "We need to take Morris down," he said. "If he falls, the entire system crumbles with him." Marcus chuckled on the other end. "I thought you'd say that. I've already started pulling together everything we need. But we have a problem." James's jaw tightened. "What is it?" "The mayor," Marcus said. "She's trying to play both sides. Publicly, she's condemning Carter, but behind closed doors, she's pressuring the DA to go easy on him. She doesn't want to go up against the police union." James exhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain calm. "Then we give her no choice." James had always understood that the media was one of the most powerful weapons in any legal battle. If the mayor was hesitant to take action against Morris, then he would make sure she had no other option. That night, Natalie's news outlet released another bombshell article. It detailed Chief Morris's long history of covering up police misconduct, complete with leaked internal documents proving that he had personally intervened to protect officers from disciplinary action. But that wasn't all. James and Marcus had found a key witness, a former officer who had resigned in disgust after being pressured to lie in an excessive force investigation. His testimony, combined with the leaked documents, was devastating. By morning, the mayor was facing a political firestorm. The pressure was mounting, and with an election year approaching, she could no longer afford to protect Morris. At a hastily organized press conference, she announced that Chief Morris would be placed on administrative leave pending an independent investigation. It was a calculated move. She wasn't firing him yet, but she was distancing herself from the controversy. James watched the press conference from his office, shaking his head. The mayor was trying to buy time, but he wasn't going to let her. He picked up his phone and dialed the district attorney. "We need to talk," he said. The district attorney, Eleanor Dawson, had built her career on being tough on crime. But she was also ambitious. And James knew how to use that to his advantage. They met in her office later that afternoon. She sat behind her desk, her expression unreadable as James laid out his case. "I have enough evidence to prove that Chief Morris obstructed justice multiple times," he said. "If you charge him now, you'll be the one who finally takes down a corrupt police chief. Think about what that does for your career." Eleanor leaned back in her chair, studying him. "And if I don't?" James met her gaze without blinking. "Then I take this case to the federal level. I go over your head. And when this all comes crashing down, you'll be remembered as the DA who protected a dirty cop." Silence stretched between them. Finally, Eleanor sighed. "You really don't leave people with much of a choice, do you?" James smiled. "No, I don't." The next morning, Chief Morris was officially charged with obstruction of justice and conspiracy to cover up police misconduct. The news sent shockwaves through the city. James knew this was a turning point. For years, men like Morris had hidden behind their badges. Untouchable, invincible. But now, the world was watching, and justice was finally coming for them. The courtroom was packed. James had been in hundreds of trials before, but this one felt different. There was an energy in the air, a sense that something monumental was about to happen. On one side of the courtroom sat Daniel Carter, his once arrogant demeanor replaced by a cold, hardened expression. His lawyer, a high-powered attorney funded by the police union, whispered furiously in his ear. On the other side sat the family of Harold Evans, James's mother, his aunts, uncles, cousins. They had all come to see justice served. And in the middle of it all stood James Evans, ready to do what he did best. The trial began with the prosecution laying out its case. They played the video that had ignited a firestorm of protests. The video that had forced an entire city to confront its own ugly reality. The jury watched in silence as Harold Evans, an elderly man with nothing but a grocery bag and a cane, was thrown against a police car and humiliated in broad daylight. James watched Carter's face as the video played. There was no remorse, no guilt, just the blank indifference of a man who had never believed he would face consequences for his actions. The prosecution then called witnesses, bystanders who had seen the attack. Medical experts who testified that Harold's injuries had contributed to his death. Former colleagues of Carter who, under oath, admitted that he had a history of excessive force. Then it was James's turn. He stood and walked slowly toward the jury. His voice steady, measured. "My father was not a criminal," he said. "He was a teacher, a father, a man who believed in kindness, in fairness, in justice. He spent his entire life teaching children to be better people. And for that, he was beaten. He was humiliated. He was thrown away like his life didn't matter." James paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "And the man who did it? The man who took my father from me? He's sitting right there. And he still doesn't think he did anything wrong." Carter's lawyer objected, but James ignored him. He turned back to the jury, his voice rising. "This isn't just about my father. It's about every single person who has ever been told that their life is worth less because of the color of their skin. It's about every victim of police brutality who never got justice. It's about whether we, as a society, will finally say, 'Enough.'" Silence filled the courtroom. The trial was far from over. But James knew, in that moment, that he had already won something far greater. He had made them listen. And that was the first step toward real justice. The courtroom was silent. The weight of James's words still hung in the air, thick and unyielding. The jurors sat stiffly in their seats, their expressions unreadable. But James knew he had reached them. He could see it in their eyes, the way they shifted uncomfortably. The way some of them glanced at Daniel Carter with something that almost resembled disgust. Carter, for his part, remained impassive, but James could see the tension in his clenched jaw, the slight twitch in his fingers. For the first time, the man who had carried himself with arrogance, who had laughed in the faces of those he had brutalized, was beginning to understand that he wasn't untouchable anymore. The defense had little to work with. Carter's lawyer, a sleek, high-powered attorney paid for by the police union, did his best to spin the case in Carter's favor. He tried to paint Harold Evans as uncooperative, suggested that Carter had acted within the bounds of his duty, that his use of force was justified because officers had to make split-second decisions. James didn't let them get away with it. During cross-examination, he tore Carter's credibility apart. Piece by piece, he forced him to admit that Harold had posed no threat. He made him stumble over his own words when confronted with his long history of violence. He exposed every lie, every excuse. By the time Carter stepped down from the witness stand, his confidence had crumbled. The prosecution rested its case. James sat at the plaintiff's table, his hands clasped together as he watched the judge instruct the jury before sending them off to deliberate. Now, all he could do was wait. Outside the courthouse, the world was watching. Protesters gathered in the streets, their signs held high, news cameras flashed, reporters swarmed, their microphones thrust forward, eager for any updates. James didn't give them any. He had done his part. Now, it was in the hands of the jury. But deep down, he knew, this wasn't just about Carter anymore. This verdict would send a message. And he prayed that message would be the right one. The jury deliberated for 2 days. For 48 agonizing hours. James barely slept. He paced the halls of his office, his mind racing through every possible outcome. He had won difficult cases before. But this one was different. This wasn't just about legal strategy. It was about justice. It was about his father. On the morning of the third day, the courtroom was packed once again. The tension was suffocating. Reporters filled every available seat, their pens poised, their cameras ready. Outside, thousands waited, holding their breath. The bailiff called the court to order. The jury filed in, their faces grim. James felt his heart hammer against his ribs. The judge turned to the jury foreperson. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" A middle-aged woman with short gray hair stood, a piece of paper clutched in her hands. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady. The judge nodded. "Please read the verdict." The courtroom held its breath. The foreperson cleared her throat. "In the case of the state versus Daniel Carter, on the charge of second-degree assault, we find the defendant guilty." A collective gasp rippled through the room. James exhaled sharply, gripping the edge of the table. He barely heard the rest of the verdict being read, barely processed the noise swelling around him. Guilty. It wasn't enough to bring his father back. It wasn't enough to undo the pain, the years of injustice. But it was something. And for now, it would have to be enough. The sentence hearing was held a week later. The prosecution pushed for the maximum sentence, 20 years behind bars. Carter's lawyer begged for leniency. arguing that his client was a dedicated officer who had made a mistake. James felt sick at the words. A mistake. That was what they always called it. Wasn't it? A mistake. An unfortunate accident. A misunderstanding. As if Carter hadn't knowingly brutalized his father. As if this hadn't been a pattern of violence stretching back years. He stood when it was his turn to speak. I've been a lawyer for a long time, he said, his voice even. I've spent my career fighting for victims of injustice. I've seen cases like this before, too many of them. And I've seen how they usually end. He turned to the judge. They end with the officer walking free. The courtroom was silent. That cannot happen here, James said, his voice rising. Not this time. If we truly want to believe in justice, then we cannot allow men like Daniel Carter to escape accountability. If my father's life meant anything, if the lives of every victim of police brutality mean anything, then this court must send a message that this kind of violence will not be tolerated. The judge listened. When the sentence was handed down, Carter was given 15 years in prison. It wasn't the full 20 James had wanted, but it was still a rare victory. A police officer had been convicted. And for once, he would face real consequences. James stood outside the courthouse, staring at the sea of people gathered before him. The verdict had sent shockwaves through the city. It was one of the first times a white officer had been convicted for assaulting a black civilian. Some hailed it as a turning point. Others called it a dangerous precedent. James knew better than to believe that this was the end. There would be more cases. More men like Daniel Carter. More battles to fight. But for today, at least, they had won. A reporter pushed forward, microphone in hand. Mr. Evans, what do you have to say about today's verdict? James exhaled slowly. He thought about his father. About the man who had raised him to believe in justice, even when the system seemed rigged against him. He thought about the nights he had spent studying law, determined to make a difference. He thought about every client he had ever represented, every mother who had lost a son, every name that had been reduced to a headline. Then, he met the reporter's gaze. This is just the beginning, he said. The fight for justice never ended. And James Evans would never stop fighting. James Evans didn't celebrate victories. Not the way most people did. He didn't pop champagne, didn't go out for drinks, didn't bask in the praise from the media. He had learned long ago that every battle won was just a momentary pause before the next fight began. The conviction of Daniel Carter had sent shockwaves through the system. But James knew the backlash was coming. It always did. The police union had already started pushing for an appeal. Conservative media outlets were calling Carter a victim of racial hysteria, painting him as a sacrificial lamb for a broken system. And then came the threats. They arrived in the form of letters, phone calls, emails. Some were vague warnings to watch his back. Others were more explicit, detailed descriptions of what would happen to him if he continued his crusade. James wasn't afraid. He had received threats before. But this time, they weren't just coming for him. Marcus called him late one night, his voice unusually tense. James, you need to see this. He forwarded an email that had been sent to his firm's general inbox. James clicked the link, and his stomach clenched. It was a photograph, his mother, standing outside the small church she attended every Sunday. The caption underneath was short, chilling. You don't stop. She won't make it to next Sunday. James felt something deep, primal, and furious rise inside him. This wasn't about him anymore. They were going after his family. And that meant they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. James had always played by the rules. He believed in the law, even when it failed people who looked like him, even when it failed his father. But this was different. He called Marcus again, his voice tight. Find out who sent that email. Marcus didn't ask questions. He understood. I'm on it. The next morning, James went to see his mother. She was in the kitchen, humming an old hymn as she stirred a pot of soup. The moment she saw his face, she stopped. What is it, baby? She asked, setting the spoon down. James hesitated. He didn't want to scare her, but he couldn't lie. He showed her the email. She read it slowly, then looked up at him with calm, steady eyes. I knew this was coming, she said softly. James frowned. Mom, no, listen to me, she interrupted. You're doing something important, James. You're shaking the foundation of a system that was built to keep men like you in their place. Of course they're scared, and scared men do desperate things. She reached out, placing a gentle hand on his cheek. "But I raised you to be strong. And I raised you to be smart. You're not going to let them win, are you?" James swallowed the lump in his throat and shook his head. "No, ma'am." "Then do what you need to do," she said firmly. "But be careful. I don't want to lose you too." James nodded. He had made a decision. If they wanted to play dirty, he was going to show them just how dangerous it was to underestimate him. Marcus worked fast. Within 24 hours, he had traced the email back to an IP address linked to a retired police officer named Gerald Whitman, a man with deep ties to the police union and a long history of racist rhetoric. But that wasn't all. Marcus dug deeper and found that Whitman had been in contact with Chief Richard Morris, the disgraced police chief who had been forced to step down after James exposed his corruption. It didn't take much to put the pieces together. This was revenge. Morris and his allies in the department had lost their power, and now they wanted to make James pay for it. James took the evidence straight to the FBI. It wasn't long before Whitman was arrested. The FBI raided his home and found an arsenal of illegal weapons. Along with a list of targets, James's name was at the top. The news broke the next day. Former police chief and retired officer tied to death threats against civil rights attorney. It was a scandal unlike anything the city had ever seen. The police department scrambled to distance itself from the men involved. The mayor, desperate to salvage her reputation, condemned the threats and vowed a full investigation. James watched the chaos unfold, his expression unreadable. He had spent his entire life fighting against men like Whitman, men like Morris, and now, finally, they were starting to fall. But he wasn't done yet. There was still more work to do. 1 year later, the city had changed. It wasn't perfect, far from it. But things were different now. Daniel Carter was behind bars. The corrupt leadership of the police department had been exposed and dismantled. And new reforms were being introduced, small steps towards something better. James stood in front of a packed auditorium, looking out at the crowd gathered for a symposium on police reform. Lawyers, activists, journalists, students, all of them here because they believed in something bigger than themselves. He cleared his throat, gripping the podium. "My father believed in justice," he said, even when it failed him, even when it failed people who looked like him. He believed in the idea that the law could be used as a force for good. He exhaled slowly. "I used to believe that too. But after what happened to him, I realized something." He let the silence stretch for a moment. Justice isn't something that happens on its own. It isn't handed to us. We have to fight for it. We have to demand it. And when they try to silence us, we have to raise our voices even louder. The crowd erupted into applause. James stepped back from the microphone, his eyes drifting to the front row, where his mother sat, watching him with quiet pride. He had spent his entire life fighting for justice. And he wasn't going to stop now.